everybody. Whoa, I will not project so much. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I know that you could be on a plane going back to your home, so I appreciate very much you staying to talk with me and have this interaction. The other thing I'd like to thank you all for is for having me here with you this week. I arrived on Saturday. I've been going to some of the sessions and talking with you in the hallways and over coffee, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been a fascinating experience, and I think there's actually a lot of overlap in what we do. So I hope to explore some of that in the talk today. So first off, my project is called HI-SEAS. That stands for Hawaii Space Exploration, Analog and Simulation. And it's a very large team. I can't give all their names, but they're up there and on our website. I should just warn you, unlike the previous two plenaries, this is a very traditional talk with a traditional structure. So first, what I'm going to do is tell you about stuff I care passionately about. I'm going to wave my hands around and try to convince you that you should care passionately about them too. Failing that, I'm going to try to put forward an analogy between my stuff and your stuff. And then finally, I'm going to say why my stuff is so awesome, in the understanding that your stuff is awesome too, but I don't know what it is yet, so we should talk. First, NASA. NASA is planning to go to Mars. We've got rovers there already, but we're planning to send humans to Mars round about 2035, so about 20 years from now. The cynical amongst you are probably saying, yeah, you've been saying you're going to go to Mars 20 years from now for the past 50 years. And that is true. However, in the current atmosphere at NASA, there is funds, not as much funds as we need, but there are funds that will go towards this endeavor. They're actively building hardware, and they're actively ticking off the problems that we'll have to overcome before the journey. So it is a real active program now. Of course, with changes in the presidency in particular and national priorities in general, that could change at any moment. How are we going to get there? Well, the current Mars reference mission has us sending a crew of 4 to 6 people to Mars and back again. You might have heard in the news about Mars One, which is a proposal that we send people one way. It's an interesting proposal for all sorts of reasons, but NASA is not having any of that. NASA brings its astronauts back again. And the round trip is going to be between 2.5 and 3 years. That's a long time. Also, Mars is much further than we have ever gone in space before. Right now, the ISS is a couple hundred miles above Earth. It's in low Earth orbit. Mars is millions of miles away. So this is a very serious endeavor, and it's not like anything we've done before. So I've said that my project is an analog. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that what we've done is we've found a place on Earth, and we've created a place on Earth that is similar to Mars in interesting and relevant ways for the kind of research we do. So it's analogous to a place on Mars. Now, there's lots of analogs in the world, and I'm going to show you a couple others that aren't mine. And then I'm going to explain why the HI-SEAS analog in particular is particularly good for the kind of research I'm going to talk about today. So the analog you're seeing here is Devon Island. It's an island up in the Canadian high Arctic. It's in the Arctic Circle. And that's where the FMARS mission happened that I was a chief scientist on. So we were there, locked into that tiny little habitat for 4 months, only able to go outside in our spacesuits. And Devon Island is a really good physical analog for Mars. It's an Arctic desert. It's very dry, very cold, not as dry or as cold as Mars. It's very remote, not as remote as Mars. And it's hazardous, although not as hazardous as Mars. So it's a very good place to look at human psychology, but also to do geological field work that's relevant to Mars. So how do we use analogs? We use them in a couple of different ways. One is we use them to discover problems and to test solutions to those problems. There's all sorts of problems that you don't discover until you've integrated people and technology and equipment and procedures and tested them rigorously over long durations. So an example, a Mars habitat is a crowded, noisy place. It's just the nature of the beast. And that can affect sleep. So how many of you have ever had a bad night's sleep? Yeah, okay. How many of you have had a week of poor sleep? Okay. How many of you have had a month of poor sleep? How many of you have had 4 months of poor sleep? And then it's the mothers in the audience, okay. So what we find with sleep is that your performance degrades right away with one night of poor sleep. And it continues to degrade and gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And that at round about 100 days, it falls off a cliff. And your performance becomes severely impaired, and you start to make very serious mistakes. You should not be driving a car, and you should not be driving a spaceship. So, there's not yet been a fatal accident in space that was due to loss of sleep, but there have been close calls. So we're very interested in how do you help the astronauts get a good night's sleep, how do you recognize when their performance is starting to degrade, and how do you make sure they're not behind the wheel if they're in that state. So that's an example of a situation that you really only start to see the effects of over these long durations. Another way we use analogs is what we call design in the context of use. This is a computer science term, computer engineering term, standard practice in the industry. And the idea here is if you want to design something good, whether it's hardware or software, you don't just tell your team to go sit in a room somewhere and think real hard. You send them to the environment where this thing is going to be used. So, for example, if you're designing medical records software, you send your team to the hospital, to the doctor's office. They watch how the files are used, who uses them, how do they use them, who do they pass them to when they're done. Look at all of that, then start to design your software. And when you have a prototype, you send it back into that environment to test it. Great, fantastic procedure. You can't do it on Mars. Because by definition, you can't send your software designers to Mars before the astronauts go. So how do we get around this problem? Well, we can send them to an analog. And that way they can understand how whatever it is they're designing can be used, and they can test it, and they can make sure that it's really robust and does what it needs to do. This analog, by the way, this is Mauna Kea in Hawaii, which has, the soil there is very Mars-like, so NASA likes to send its rovers there to test that they perform well on the soil. And in fact, the Apollo astronauts also trained on Mauna Kea. We also use analogs to integrate people and systems. So this obviously isn't a very good physical analog for Mars because it's a lake. It's Pavilion Lake in Canada, which is a very deep, narrow lake. But what you see here is an astronaut in a one-man submarine, which is analogous to an astronaut in a rover. You see a scuba diver in scuba equipment, which is analogous to an astronaut in a spacesuit. And you see an autonomous underwater vehicle, which is analogous to an autonomous robot. And they have to work together in this complex, hazardous environment to accomplish significant scientific tasks. So it's a really good operational analog for Mars. And we can learn a lot about how these systems can work together. Here's mine. This is High Seas. It's at about 8,000 feet in a disused quarry on the side of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And it's a geodesic dome. It's got room for 6 people, not much room for 6 people. It's about 1,000 square feet of interior space. It's completely off the grid, uses solar and hydrogen fuel cells for power. And as you can see, it's in a very Mars-like environment. If you got rid of the blue sky, this would look just like the pictures the rovers are sending back from Mars. It's also a very isolated environment. There's no plant life that you can see. There's no animal life that you can see except for the occasional spider. They get very fond of the spiders. And there's no human activity. Off in the distance on top of Mauna Kea, you can see the glint off the telescopes, but that's about it. So they're very visually isolated. But what's nice is they're actually not very physically isolated. If we need to get them out of the hab into a hospital, we can have them there in 20 minutes. Now you might say, wait a second, you can't get people back from Mars in 20 minutes, so why is that a good thing? It's a good thing because, unfortunately, I have to be ethical. The Institutional Review Board insists that we don't kill our subjects, and so having them be accessible like that means we can mess with them more. If they were in Antarctica where we couldn't get them to a hospital quickly, we would have to, of course, we have safety procedures here as well, but we wouldn't be able to mess with them the way that we're able to mess with them here. We can apply stressors in strategic ways that you would not be able to apply to a crew in Antarctica. Why is NASA excited about this? Well, let me tell you about how NASA manages risk. For any given mission profile, they have a list of risks. And this ranges from everything from the rocket blowing up to someone having a migraine, okay? All of those risks are colored either green, which means we got this, yellow, which means we haven't quite got it, but we think it's minor enough or unlikely enough that we're okay with it. And then there are the red risks. NASA will not fly any mission profile while there are still red risks on that list. So our job is to move those over into the yellow and green columns. And our habitat isn't good for all of those risks. We can't study radiation in our habitat. We can't study the effects of microgravity. The gravity in Hawaii is exactly the same as everywhere else on Earth, more or less. But there are a lot of risks that we can study. And those are the ones that involve crews in isolation and confinement for these long durations. Okay, what does it look like? This is the ground floor. It's got a kitchen, it's got a lab, it's got a large multi-use area, which they can reconfigure to be an exercise area, general work area, and so on. It also has a bathroom. Now, everyone always asks about bathrooms, so let me answer your questions. Oh, by the way, when astronauts speak, they know they always get questions about bathrooms and about sex. I'll talk to you about bathrooms. So our bathrooms are composting toilets, fairly high-tech composting toilets, and a shower. Now, water in any simulation of Mars is a highly valued resource. You want to use as little as possible, and you want to recycle as much as possible. So our crew shower times are restricted to 8 minutes per person per week. I want to tell you, one of the signs that we have got a crew who are very astronaut-like is how they respond to rules like that. Our current crew have voluntarily restricted themselves to 4 minutes of shower per week. Plus, on our first crew, one crew member decided that showers weren't all that interesting and went the entire 4 months of the mission without taking a shower. His crewmates said it was fine, just for the record. He did clean himself, but he used baby wipes, not water falling on his head, so it wasn't too bad. Okay, and then upstairs, this is where the bedrooms are. We have 6 very small staterooms. They are, well, the beds are about the size of 4 of those chairs put together, so very small cots, and that's the end of the pizza pie, and there's room for a tiny, tiny little desk and chair, and there's a door that can shut, and that's really important. You need to have some privacy, even in space. We monitor a lot of what's going on. The habitat is instrumented. We're tracking power usage, water usage, CO2 levels, temperature, everything that we can track. And this is the dashboard that we use to see what's going on. We do not film the crew 24/7. This is not Big Brother. We do film some of their interactions, their meetings, and their activities outside the habitat, but not everything. This is our main way of tracking how the crew are doing physically in the habitat. Communications is interesting. So communications with Mars depends on the position of the planets. When Earth and Mars are on the same side of the sun, so as close as they can get together, it takes about 4 minutes at the speed of light for a signal to get from one to the other. When they're on opposite sides of the planet, it's more like 25 minutes. So that means that all communication is slow. For our crews, we've imposed a 20-minute latency. And what that means is, when they send an email, no one sees it for 20 minutes. And their fastest they can possibly get an answer is 40 minutes. If they want to surf the web, which they don't, or they do want to, but they don't do it, when they click something, the next page won't come up for 40 minutes. Okay? This means no real-time communications, no significant social networking, no streaming videos, no YouTube, no cute cats, none of that. So most of our interactions with the crew are by email. They can record video and record audio and send those, but that's quite a lot of effort, so they don't always do that. Mission support. So this is what one configuration of NASA's mission support looks like, and this is what you might imagine that we have. We do not. This is one area in which our simulation is low fidelity. Instead of having a mission control like NASA does, which we simply can't afford, we have a distributed network of mission support volunteers, highly professional, but we don't pay them, which is the ideal combination. And they're scattered all over the world. They interact with the crew via email and via a mission support management system, but they're not all together in the same room, which is a bummer because it would make a nice picture. Do they go outside? Yes, they do. They go out on EVAs, which is NASA-E's for going outside. It stands for extravehicular activity. But they can only go outside in their spacesuits, which are not real spacesuits. They're not real life support systems, but they're mock-ups. So the idea is that they simulate the wake, awkwardness, bulkiness, visual restrictions of a real spacesuit. And not only that, but they can't just say, to heck with this, put on a spacesuit and go outside. They have to plan their EVAs, request permission from mission support to do them, and go out in groups of at least 2. So really, there's no getting away from the other people. When you get frustrated and annoyed, going to heck with this and going for a stomp outside is not one of your options. So something else about the area around the habitat. As I said, it's very Mars-like. One of the intriguing things about it is that it's full of lava tubes. There are several lava tube systems in the area, which are these very long caves, snake-like caves. And we believe, that NASA has them, or that Mars has them too. Why are these interesting? Well, a couple of reasons. Radiation is a big issue on Mars. Okay? Mars doesn't have a magnetosphere, so it's not protected from a lot of the radiation in the solar system. So how do you survive on the surface? Well, you seek shelter. And the best shelter from radiation, or one of the best, is a big, thick layer of rock. So the lava tubes could serve as a radiation shelter for astronauts if there was a bout of solar activity and they had to seek shelter. Even more interestingly, one of the tasks of astronauts on Mars, the primary task, is to look for life. And where would you look for signs of life, either current or past? In a radiation shelter would not be a bad idea. So we're really interested in developing the methods for exploring these lava tubes on Mars. So that's one of the things that our crews do. They map out the lava tube systems and they explore them. How do we select our crews? Oh, just before I talk about it, I'd like to point out on this slide that we've got 2 kinds of suits. We've got what we call the Hollywood suits, which is the pretty white one on your left. And then we have the hazmat suits. Okay, the hazmat suits are modified hazmat suits, again, to simulate the weight and the bulk of a suit. When crews start, they always prefer the Hollywood suits. They want those awesome selfies. But after about a month in the habitat, they strongly prefer the hazmat suits because they're a much better physical, from the inside, simulation of what a suit might be like. Both do the job. Okay, we've had 4 missions. Our very first mission was 4 months long, and its primary goal, what NASA was funding on this mission, was a food study, as you can tell by the spork in the patch. And the goal there was to compare two different food systems. So it really was an engineering trade study. The systems we were comparing are the current food system that they use on the ISS, which is little individually pre-prepared, dried, or mostly dried, individual entrees. And that's necessarily what you have on the ISS, right? Because in microgravity, it is really hard to cook. You put the ingredients into the bowl, they fly out again. It's super messy. So they're stuck with that, and that's fine, because they're so close to Earth, as I say, a couple hundred miles, that sending them more food is easy, relatively. However, on a Mars trip, that's not going to work for a couple of reasons, or it's not going to be the primary food system for a couple of reasons. One is bulk. In space, mass is money. For a Mars mission to actually happen, we need to get the weight of everything down. And the packaging on those individual meals is significant in terms of mass. So we need to get rid of that. The other problem is those individual meals are shelf stable, but they're not shelf stable for the 2.5 to 3 years of a Mars mission. And they need to be. So instead, we're comparing that food system with something a lot closer to cooking. Because when you're on the surface of Mars, there's enough gravity to keep that food in your bowl. So we give our crews bulk ingredients, and then they can cook them more or less like we do here on Earth. Now, those need to be shelf stable, so they're freeze-dried and nothing fresh, but you can make real food. So that was what we were doing, and we gave NASA the numbers they need to figure out for a Mars mission how much they need to send of each and the ingredients they need to send. There's another advantage to the cooking approach. With a pre-prepared entree, let's say it's lasagna now, it will always be lasagna. But if you have pasta, tomato powder, some herbs and spices, some cheese, maybe some freeze-dried ground meat, you can combine those in many different ways to produce many different dishes. And that's really powerful. So you might ask, a food study, really, is that worth all this effort? Well, it is, but our basic philosophy is if you're going to lock people in a can for 4 months, 8 months, 12 months, you want to get as much data out of them as possible. So we bring on a whole bunch of what we call opportunistic research projects. At any given time, there's 6 to 10 research projects that the crew are doing in the HAB. So here's some of the other activities that first crew did, in addition to the cooking. They were doing an exercise study. They did a study on how the nose and the olfactory system changes in the habitat. They did some work with 3D printing. They did a really fun study looking at whether robot animals, robot pets, could help the crew feel better about being trapped in the habitat. And I'll tell you the answer to that. People who have pets at home really like the robot pets. People who do not have pets at home hated them. The commander on that mission was one of the people who did not have pets at home, and one of the other crew members took considerable offense when the dinosaur flew across the room, probably having been kicked. So that was one of the sources of conflict on that crew. One of the other sources of conflict on that crew is what is still referred to in hushed tones as the Nutella incident, which I think you can probably imagine. And they also did a sleep study. That's the bottom right-hand image. Okay, so that was the first mission. We're now on the fourth. The second, third, and fourth missions were all under the research project, which has the wonderful name, I think, Key Contributors to the Maintenance and Regulation of Team Function and Performance on Long-Duration Exploration Missions. In English, how do you stop your crew from killing each other? It had the same basic conditions as the first mission, the same basic crew selection strategy, which I didn't talk about. I should talk about that some more. And the theme is, well, here's the problem. Are there any astronauts in the room? No, okay. So I can share a secret with you. astronauts are liars. You ask an astronaut, how are you doing? They say, fine, awesome. How are you getting on with your crewmates? Great, exactly. So you don't hear about the problems, and remember, all you're really getting is emails. You don't hear about the problems until they've become critical, and that itself is a problem. So our current study is actually a whole set of studies that are all looking at passively detecting the state of individual crew members and the crew as a whole. So for example, one of our studies is from MSU, and we have the crew wear sociometric badges. Now the badges don't record what people are saying because that would be too much of an invasion of privacy, and astronauts don't like that either. But it does record the volume of the crew member's voice, and it records the proximity between the badges. So you might imagine if you've got two people standing face to face and the volume of their voices is really high, what's going on? It's a fight, right? Or an argument. And if you've got two badges that never come near each other, then you've got people who are probably avoiding each other, and that might be a red flag as well. So we've got this whole set of studies, as I say, that are trying to passively detect issues before they become serious problems. So I promised I would talk about crew selection, and then I got distracted. We have to select crews that are as astronaut-like as possible. And when we first put out the call for volunteers, I thought we would have to struggle to get a crew. We had 700 applicants, and they fight to be on the crew. There is serious competition to get on these crews, which is fantastic. Now, I have to say, of those 700, not all of them were qualified. We need people with astronaut-like educational backgrounds, professional backgrounds. We do psychology screening to make sure we get people who are as astronaut-like as possible mentally. We need people who are physically very fit. Not all those 700 met those criteria. In fact, we had one, which I loved. A father wrote in to volunteer his 8-year-old son. He said, I've got 2 others, you can have this one. And so of those 700, only about 150 met our basic qualifications, which we then down-selected to a pool of 30. And then we have the challenge of composing the crew, because the right way to do this is not to simply pick your 6 highest qualified candidates. You need to compose a crew that has a mixed set of skill sets, but also has psychologies that will complement each other and work well together, which is a challenge. So some of the problems that we expect to see and indeed have seen. One is what we call crew-ground disconnect. And this happens on all sorts of missions, including military missions, and anytime you've got an away team who are away for a significant length of time under stressful circumstances, and a ground team who's there to support them. What happens is at some point in the mission, the crew starts thinking things like, what are mission support doing? They're not responding quickly enough. They don't understand what we're going through. They get to go home and have a beer at the end of the day. Why aren't they stepping up and doing their job? About the same time, mission support starts thinking things like, why are they being such prima donnas? I'm just asking them to do this one thing. Why don't they step up and do their jobs? Okay? So it can be a significant problem, because I know we all think that about our coworkers every now and then, but we can hash it out in the hallway. We can have a beer and discuss it. We don't have that option with our crews. So we train both our crew and our mission support to recognize some of the warning signs of this, and we're starting to develop some strategies for how you overcome it. Another issue is third quarter syndrome, and I'm not sure it exists, but part of our research is finding out whether these things exist or not, but it's been observed in Antarctica, and the idea is that for a given mission length, for the first quarter, you're getting settled in, you're excited to be there, you're getting all set up. The second quarter, you've hit your groove, you're looking forward to halfway, you're getting some really good work done. The fourth quarter, you're looking forward to getting home, you're starting to pack up, you're scurrying to wrap up your project. But that third quarter is a bit of a bummer. There you see, or you might expect to see, signs of depression, lethargy, lack of interest in the work, and so on. So we're looking for that, and we think it's potentially a serious concern. And I already talked a little bit about the challenge of detecting depression and other mood disorders and providing support so that we can get past them. I talked a little bit about opportunistic research. One of the opportunistic research projects on the last mission that you might find interesting was using 3D printers to print out surgical instruments. The logic there being you might have to do a surgery, and you might not have all of the bits and pieces you need. So 3D printing is a really interesting resource that we're looking at. The 8-month crew finished in June, and we currently have a 12-month crew, but first I want to talk about how the 8-month crew came back to Earth. Normally, we just do the very mundane thing of driving a van up the mountain and getting them. But this crew decided to do something a little bit different. One of them was friends with a member of the Golden Knights. That's the US Army parachute display team. So instead of a van, a helicopter full of Golden Knights landed at the site. The crew got on board, and then we dropped them onto Kona. That's one of our crew members diving out. It was pretty awesome, a pretty exciting event. And it was after 8 months of sensory deprivation, it was apparently a crazy, crazy, crazy rush. Even stepping outside the habitat after not seeing the outside world except through the visor of a spacesuit is a rush. Crew members tell me it's like going from a black and white TV to IMAX in a single step. Everything's bright and clear and fresh and crispy and colorful, and it blows your little mind. So this is our current crew. They're in for 12 months. They're about 4.5 months into it. The cracks are starting to show. But I have every confidence, they're highly professional, that they are going to work their way through and complete the 12-month mission. So, one of the things I wanted to put out to you guys is the possibility of opportunistic research projects. I don't know all your areas, but it's possible that you have a piece of equipment, a protocol, something else that would benefit NASA, could advance human space exploration, and could usefully be tested in our environment. If so, come talk to me. This is one of the opportunistic research projects we rejected. Not for the reasons you might think. In China in particular, they're very interested in using mealworms as a protein source on long-duration missions. They're great because they eat waste, they're full of protein, highly nutritious, and a bit gross, but I've eaten them, they're fine-ish. You can pretend they're little shrimp. In the end, we had a long discussion with the Chinese Space Agency about bringing their mealworm farm into the habitat, and we were about to go ahead with it when one of their grad students let slip that the mealworms are little escape artists, that she was always having to go in and sweep them off the floor, and she'd find them in other parts of the lab. Our location on Mauna Loa is highly environmentally sensitive, and I'm not going to be responsible for introducing a new species to Mars. So we vetoed that. Okay, so I've had the joy of being here the past few days, and as I said, it was a fantastic experience. So I wanted to talk about some themes that I think our work has in common. 1, bootstrapping. Our research is currently funded with $1.2 million, which is a lot of money. Except when you think that this is to keep a Mars simulation operating for 3 years. Of those 3 years, that's 24 months of active simulation. It's not a lot of money. Even the food for keeping these crews takes a significant chunk of that. Our project, although it's got lots of people working on it, probably about 100 at this point, I haven't counted, has only 2 people who are paid. One of them is only a third time, and one is a grad student. So, it takes a lot of bootstrapping to really make this work. I need to tell a story. We've had a lot of very positive press, which has been fantastic. I need to tell the story of the one case of poor press we've had, which is when a certain senator from Arkansas, Once a year, he puts out what he calls his waste book, which is a list of government-funded projects which he considers to be wasteful. And in our first year of operations, we were number 6. And the way he summarized our project was spending millions of dollars to fly students to Hawaii to eat space pizza. Clearly not how I would describe it, but there we go. So we're always having to justify and explain that what we're doing is producing real value for NASA, and it's cheap. If we had to do this kind of research in orbit, you could add 2 zeros onto the end of it. So the way to do that bootstrapping is to really make use of the passion that people have for space exploration. And it really is wonderful, this team of mission support people and crews and so on that have been involved. So what we have here is 3 of our mission support people. We've got Andre, Neil, Cosmo the dog, and Essek. Andre and Essek were 2 interns that we had. Neil's a grad student, and Cosmo, of course, is mission support. He's the one who keeps me sane. And he likes the outfits, I swear. Fidelity. In any simulation, as you all know, some things are going to be high fidelity, very realistic, and some things are going to be low fidelity. So there's a constant tussle about which things we need to raise the fidelity on and which things are not so important. So one of the themes here is that we need to make sure that for any given research project, the needs of that research project match well with a particular analog in question. So, as I pointed out, our analog's not very hazardous. So if your study is looking at the psychology of crews under hazardous conditions, we're not the analog for you. But if what you're interested in is integrating humans and technology in an isolated and confined environment, then we might be the analog for you. One thing that's really important with these crews, a person participating in a simulation can suspend their disbelief and can pretend for a certain amount of time. They cannot do it for 12 months. So what you need to do is be able to give the crew meaningful work so that they're really accomplishing something. They're not just pushing a big red button once a day because you've told them they have to push a big red button once a day. So we work really hard to make sure that the geology they're doing is publishable research, that the work we have them do in the HAB is actual work that has meaning outside. I'm always asked, is that geodesic dome, is that what a real Mars habitat would look like? And the answer is, I don't know. We have a Mars reference mission, so we've got some parameters, but part of the research we're doing will feed into the design of a Mars habitat. So making the habitat more realistic is an iterative process. As we learn something, we tell NASA about it, they adjust the reference mission, we adjust the habitat. So for example, the mission I was on up in the Arctic, we reduced our water use as much as possible. The reference mission at the time said that astronauts require 35 liters of water per person per day. We worked really hard at it, and we got it down to 12 liters of water per person per day, including showering and drinking. We found we couldn't get it any lower. When we got lower than that, we started to delay tasks, we started to cut corners on hygiene, and so on. I'm proud to say, about 6 months ago, in the giant reference mission, which is a book this big, on one of the pages there's a chart, and in one of the cells of that chart, the number 35 has been crossed out and replaced with 12. And it's just one little tiny number, but with this kind of work, we hope to replace many more numbers in that reference mission, bringing it closer and closer to reality. And then finally, there's this intersection between science and policy. People ask, is this a realistic crew? We've got 6 people, we've got 3 men and 3 women, we've got international crew, Americans and people from other countries. We've had some trouble getting an interesting ethnically mixed crew just because of the pool that we're drawing from, but it's something we're going to continue to work on. So that's a US-based simulation. The Russian Space Agency, until quite recently, had a no women policy. Now you might say, wait a second, the first woman in space was a Russian. True. But for long-duration space missions, because of some of the studies they did, which I will tell you about over a beer if you like, because put it this way, their IRBs don't exist. There are some hairy, hairy simulations done in Russia. So the composition of the crew will have a political element to it, as well as one that's based on recommendations from scientists. In fact, politics will be more important, I'm sure. Mission critical training. And this is something where I think this community in particular can contribute. NASA has a real problem with remote medicine. Imagine you've got a crew, say a crew of 6, although 4 is frankly more realistic. You're going to have one person with medical training, one person who's an actual doctor. You're going to have other crew members with some medical training, but probably not MDs. They've been training for this mission for, say, 10 years, and they're 2 years into a 3-year-long mission. Someone needs their appendix out. Maybe it's the doctor. Okay? How do you give that crew the training they need right there and then so that they're able to safely conduct that procedure? This image, just in case you're wondering, there was a Russian in Antarctica. He was the MD at the station, and he had to remove his own appendix. So that's what you're looking at there. It is not an unrealistic scenario. Another moral of the story is, who are we training here? The answer is we're training NASA. Don't tell NASA that. NASA as an organization has a problem, and that is the space station right now is flown from the ground. Ground control really is ground control. The astronauts are scheduled down to the minute. Every movement they make is rehearsed years in advance. Every contingency is planned for. None of that is going to work on Mars. The mission is just too long, and with the communication latency each way, ground control cannot control what the astronauts are doing in every given second. So NASA needs to completely reform how it organizes missions. And one of our goals is to help NASA start to feel more confident with highly autonomous crews. And it's a long, long path. We have simulations within our simulations. So it's a 12-month-long simulation, but we also have emergency simulations. So I talked earlier about sheltering in lava tubes during a period of increased solar activity. We make our crews do that. And it's very interesting to try and run a simulation within a simulation. It's sort of suspension of disbelief. And then finally, I'm reaching the end here. One thing I'm always asked is, did you see the movie The Martian? I did. It was awesome. I read the book as well. And what did you think? Well, I thought it was great. I think there are only 2 unrealistic things about it. One is the storm at the beginning. The Martian atmosphere is just too thin to have a dust storm that's that catastrophic. And the other, I don't know why directors always insist, if you're going to do a space movie, they cannot resist having a man and a woman at opposite ends of a tether going, "Hold on," as they spin around in space. The physics is poor. If you've stopped your relative motion, you can let go of the tether. You're not going anywhere. Anyway, that's my beef. The rest of it was highly realistic. And in particular, I loved 2 moments in it. One was when the character, no spoilers here, who's been surviving on potatoes, runs out of ketchup. I mentioned the Nutella incident. It's a bad moment. Food is really important for these crews. And then the other moment that was very interesting, we're interested in cohesion, crew cohesion, and there's lots of data which says that a very cohesive crew is going to be very high performance. The crew in this movie, highly cohesive, perform highly. But a highly cohesive crew is also much, much more likely to do their own thing, to ignore ground control, go off on their own path. And in this movie, that highly cohesive crew, what do? They mutinied. That was a spoiler, sorry. So again, I thought that the movie was very realistic in that sense. Okay, and just to wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me here today. I think, and also this whole week, it's been absolutely fascinating. And I hope to talk to you about potential opportunistic research projects and maybe working together. Thank you.